In the world of live television, every second is scripted, every smile is rehearsed, every question is pre-approved. It's a world of comfortable, predictable conversation. But on this particular morning, on the nation's #1 morning show, the script was about to be set on fire. The woman in the guest chair was Simone Dubois, a celebrated author and historian, a woman known for her grace and intellect. She was there, supposedly, to discuss her new book on the forgotten women of the Renaissance. But Simone had a different chapter of history on her mind. The host, James, smiled his famous $1,000,000 smile. "Simone, before we let you go," he said, his voice warm and familiar, "our viewers are always so inspired by your long and successful marriage to the financial historian, Robert Dubois. After 40 years, what would you say is the secret to such an enduring partnership?" A quiet hush fell over the studio. Simone's smile didn't falter. She looked away from James, her gaze finding the steady, unblinking red light of the main camera. She knew millions were watching. She knew he was watching. She leaned forward, a conspiratorial glint in her eyes. "Thank you for asking, James," she said, her voice as smooth as velvet. "I'm sure Robert is watching right now from his new apartment, probably with his 25-year-old research assistant. He recently told a magazine that our marriage ended because I had become, in his words, predictable and boring. So, I thought today, I would do something a little unpredictable." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. The host's smile froze on his face. In the control room, you could almost hear the panic begin to rise. Simone's smile turned from gracious to razor-sharp. "Robert, darling," she said, speaking directly to the camera, to him, "do you remember that story you've told for decades? About your business trip to Zurich in 1998? The one that launched your entire career? I think it's finally time everyone knew the real story of where that seed money came from, and who had to pay the price for your success." The entire studio held its breath. The host was speechless. Robert Dubois, somewhere across town, was likely choking on his morning coffee. Simone wasn't just there to end an interview. She was there to end an empire built on a lie, and she was going to do it live, in front of the whole world. Every great story of betrayal, if you dig deep enough, is born from a story of great love. And for 30 years, to the outside world, Simone and Robert Dubois were the stuff of legends. At least, in the quiet, respectable world of academia and literature, they were the golden couple. She was the brilliant novelist and historian, her books praised by critics for their lyrical prose and the meticulous, almost obsessive detail of her research. He was the ambitious, charismatic financial historian, a man with a booming voice and a mind brimming with grand theories, but whose career, for years, had stubbornly refused to catch fire. They met, as if scripted by a romantic novelist, in the dusty, sun-drenched archives of a university library. Two young, hungry scholars reaching for the same obscure, leather-bound manuscript on medieval trade routes. It was a beginning straight out of one of Simone's own novels. She, a quiet and focused researcher, was drawn to his infectious, almost boyish passion, the way his eyes would light up as he spoke about the past as if it were a living, breathing thing. He, in turn, was captivated by her quiet, formidable intellect. He once told her that her mind worked like a finely tuned watch, piecing together scattered, forgotten fragments of history into a coherent, beautiful, and undeniable whole. They were a perfect intellectual match. He was the uncontainable fire, and she was the steady, brilliant light that focused his flame. They married a year later in a small ceremony in the university's gardens. Their life together was a tapestry woven with the threads of shared intellectual curiosity. Their small apartment overflowed with books, stacked on floors, chairs, and every available surface. Their evenings were not spent in front of a television, but in spirited debates over historical figures. Their conversations punctuated by the rustle of turning pages and the clinking of wine glasses. It was a marriage of the minds, and for years, it was a beautiful thing. Simone's career took off almost immediately. Her first novel, a historical fiction set in her beloved Renaissance, won a prestigious literary award. She wasn't just a writer. She became a respected voice, a public intellectual whose opinion was sought after. She handled her success with a quiet, unassuming grace. Robert, however, struggled. His theories were bold, but his writing was dry and academic, his research often unfocused. He faced a series of polite but firm rejections from publishers. His ambition, once so bright and inspiring, slowly began to curdle into a quiet, simmering bitterness. He would watch Simone on television, being interviewed about her latest bestseller, and a shadow would pass over his handsome features, a complex, painful mixture of pride in his wife and a corrosive envy he tried desperately to hide. He wanted her success, but he lacked her discipline, her patience, her art. Simone saw it all. She saw the slump in his shoulders after a rejection letter arrived. She heard the forced enthusiasm in his voice when he congratulated her on another glowing review. And because she loved him, deeply and completely, she made it her personal mission to lift him up, to build a stage worthy of the brilliance she knew he possessed. She became his silent partner, his uncredited editor. After putting in a full day on her own work, she would spend her nights with his manuscripts, a red pen in hand. She would tirelessly refine his dense academic prose, breathing life and narrative into his dry facts, making his ideas accessible and exciting. She was the ghostwriter of his best self. She leveraged her own hard-won reputation to open doors for him. She introduced him to her influential network of publishers, editors, and television producers. She would host elegant dinner parties, not for her own enjoyment, but for his benefit. She would artfully steer the conversation, creating the perfect opening for Robert to impress the right people with his knowledge. She was the invisible architect of his rise, working silently in the background, genuinely happy to see him succeed. She never saw it as a sacrifice. She saw it as a partnership, a team. "We are one entity, you and I," she would tell him, late at night when his frustration got the better of him. "Your success is my success. Your name is my name." She truly believed it. She believed in him with a fierce and unwavering loyalty, even when he was starting to lose belief in himself. The turning point, the moment that should have been their greatest shared triumph, came in the late 90s. Robert had a groundbreaking but controversial theory about the collapse of a 17th-century banking dynasty. To prove it, he needed to access private archives in Zurich, Switzerland, a costly and difficult endeavor. The university had denied his grant request, calling his theory unsubstantiated. He was crushed, on the verge of abandoning the project that he believed would define his career. Simone would not let that happen. Without a moment's hesitation, and without telling him the details, she took the entire substantial advance she had just received for her next novel and deposited it into their joint account. It was a life-changing sum of money, her security for the next 2 years. "I got a surprise foreign rights sale," she lied, a small, selfless act of deception to protect his fragile ego. "It's for you. For Zurich. Go prove them all wrong, my love. I believe in you." Robert, blinded by his own ambition, accepted the lie without question. He went to Zurich. He found the proof he needed. His subsequent book, The Zurich Collapse, became a massive international bestseller. It made him a star. He was no longer Simone's struggling husband. He was Robert Dubois, the celebrated financial historian. He was finally her equal, or so he thought. Simone watched his ascent with a full and happy heart. She stood by his side at award ceremonies, beamed from the audience during his television interviews, and felt nothing but pure, unadulterated pride. She had built her king, and she was happy to be his queen. She believed their love story had reached its perfect, triumphant climax. She had no idea. She had just forged the weapon that would one day be used against her. They say that success is a powerful magnifying glass. It doesn't truly change who you are. It just makes you more of who you've always been, amplifying the quiet whispers of your soul into a deafening roar. For Robert, success magnified a deep-seated insecurity that had lain dormant for years, buried under a mountain of academic ambition. He had spent so long in the warm, brilliant glow of Simone's shadow that now, standing in his own harsh spotlight, he seemed pathologically determined to cast a shadow of his own, one large and dark enough to blot her out completely. The change wasn't a sudden earthquake. It was a slow, almost imperceptible erosion, like a coastline giving way to the sea, one grain of sand at a time. At first, it was the small, subtle shifts in language. The we that had defined their intellectual and emotional partnership for decades slowly, and then quite deliberately, became I. It was no longer the research we did, but the research I conducted in Zurich. It was the groundbreaking theory I developed. Simone, in her infinite capacity for love and support, initially brushed it off as the harmless, boyish excitement of a man finally receiving his long-overdue recognition. She would smile from the audience during his acceptance speeches, a silent, supportive queen, genuinely happy to let her king have his moment on the throne. She didn't realize he was methodically, publicly, writing her out of their shared history, one pronoun at a time. Then, his world began to expand, while hers was implicitly expected to remain static. His life became a dizzying whirlwind of international conferences in Geneva, guest lectures at Oxford, and fawning interviews on cable news. He started to dress differently, a transformation that was both jarring and telling. The comfortable, slightly rumpled professor's tweeds he once favored were replaced by expensive, sharply tailored Italian suits in shades of charcoal and midnight blue. He developed a sudden and encyclopedic knowledge of fine wines and vintage watches. He was no longer just a historian, he was meticulously crafting a brand. And in this new, glossy branding, Simone began to feel less like his partner and more like a beloved, but slightly outdated, part of his origin story. A character to be mentioned fondly in prefaces, but not invited into the main narrative. She felt the growing distance most acutely in the quiet moments between the public triumphs. He would return home from a trip abroad, his suitcase full of expensive souvenirs, his mind buzzing with stories of important people he had met and brilliant arguments he had won. He would talk for hours, his voice animated, but he would forget to ask about her day, about the progress on her own new book, about the quiet workings of her mind which he had once found so captivating. Their late-night intellectual debates, once the lifeblood of their marriage, were replaced by his self-aggrandizing monologues. He no longer sought her opinion, he simply required her applause. She was becoming an audience, not a participant, in her own marriage, a spectator to his grand performance. The red flags, as they say, began to appear, small at first, like tiny cracks in a foundation, then with alarming frequency. He started making subtle, cutting comments about her appearance, couched as helpful suggestions. "Darling, that dress is lovely, but perhaps a bit academic? You should let my new stylist, Antoine, pick something out for you. He knows how to create an image." He would criticize her for not networking enough at the lavish parties he now threw, parties filled with his new, younger, flashier friends from the worlds of finance and media. She, the woman who had built the very bridges he now crossed so casually, was being gently scolded for not knowing how to navigate his new, treacherous world. He became obsessed with youth, with a desperate, clawing need for relevance. The distinguished silver wings at his temples were suddenly dyed a harsh, shoe-polish black. He spent hours with a personal trainer, his body becoming leaner, harder, a suit of armor against the encroaching reality of his age. He began to see Simone's quiet, graceful aging not as a shared journey, but as a personal liability, a reflection he didn't want to see. Her wisdom, which he had once leaned on so heavily, he now began to frame as being stuck in the past. Her calm, intellectual demeanor, the very quality that had once anchored him, was now labeled as boring or lacking passion. The most painful cracks, the ones that threatened the entire structure of their marriage, appeared around their intellectual connection. He stopped showing her his manuscripts altogether. When she gently offered to read a draft of his new book, a sequel to his Zurich blockbuster, he waved her off with a dismissive, almost pitying, smile. "It's fine, darling. My professional editor is handling it. It's very complex, technical stuff, a lot of market analysis. It would probably just bore you." The same woman who had painstakingly edited his breakout bestseller, who had a mind celebrated for its analytical prowess, was now being patronizingly dismissed as someone who would be bored by his work. It was a profound, intellectual rejection, and it cut her deeper than any personal insult ever could. The Zurich trip, once a secret, sacred symbol of her faith in him, became his personal myth, a story he told with increasing dramatic flair in every interview. He never mentioned her role, of course. In his constant retelling, it became a story of a lone genius, a visionary battling against a skeptical establishment, his brilliance finally recognized by a mysterious, anonymous Swiss benefactor. He had taken her greatest act of selfless love and erased her from it completely, recasting himself as the sole hero of a story that she had written. Simone watched all of this with a growing sense of dread that coiled in the pit of her stomach. She was losing him. Not to another woman, she thought at the time, but to a hollow, glittering caricature of himself. He was becoming a collection of press clippings, tailored suits, and self-aggrandizing anecdotes. The fire she had fallen in love with had become a raging inferno of ego, and it was threatening to consume everything, including the woman who had first given it oxygen. She tried to talk to him, to reach the thoughtful, insecure, brilliant man she knew was still in there somewhere. But it was like talking to a reflection in a mirror. All he could see, all he was interested in, was himself. For a long time, for longer than she would later care to admit, Simone had told herself that she was losing her husband to a ghost, the ghost of his own ego, a phantom of success. It was a painful, but somehow manageable, grief. It was an intellectual problem, a philosophical puzzle she could try to solve, a narrative she could attempt to understand as a historian. But the truth, when it finally and brutally revealed itself, was far more common, more vulgar, and 1,000,000 times more painful. She wasn't just losing him to himself, she was losing him to a younger, shinier reflection of what he desperately wished he still was. Her name was Chloe. Simone knew her, vaguely. She was 25 years old, one of Robert's graduate research assistants, with bright, hungry eyes and a relentless, unapologetic ambition that likely mirrored a younger version of Robert himself. Simone had seen her at university functions, always hovering at the edge of Robert's circle, looking at him not with the simple admiration of a student, but with the focused, predatory gaze of a climber seeking her next handhold. Simone, in her trusting nature, had dismissed her as just another adoring student, one of the many who were drawn to Robert's magnetic celebrity professor persona. She had been naive. She had forgotten that a man so pathologically obsessed with his own youth would inevitably seek a partner who could reflect that fleeting youth back at him. The signs, which had once been subtle cracks, now became gaping chasms. The business trips to London and Berlin became more frequent, often scheduled with only a day's notice. The late nights at the archives became a weekly, then twice-weekly occurrence. A new, unfamiliar scent, a sweet, almost cloying floral perfume began to cling to his suit jackets and the collar of his shirts. When Simone gently, so gently, questioned him one evening, her heart pounding with a dread she didn't want to name, he erupted in a fit of theatrical, wounded indignation. "My God, Simone, are you accusing me of infidelity?" he boomed, his voice echoing in their cavernous living room. "After 40 years of unwavering loyalty, is this what you think of me? I am working myself to the bone to maintain this life, a life you've become so accustomed to, and this is the thanks I get? Accusations?" He was a master of the art of gaslighting, of turning her legitimate suspicions into an indictment of her own character. He made her feel guilty, paranoid, and foolish for his own deceit. The final betrayal, the one that shattered any remaining illusion of their marriage, was not delivered in a quiet, tearful confrontation in the privacy of their bedroom. No, Robert, in his infinite and escalating arrogance, chose to make it a public execution, a press release announcing the death of their love. It happened on a Tuesday, a day that had, until then, been utterly unremarkable. Simone was at her desk, deep in research for her new book, when an email from her editor popped up. The subject line was a single, ominous question. "Is this true?" Attached was a link to an online article, a feature piece in Modern Man, a trendy, high-profile magazine known for its glossy profiles of powerful men. The headline was a punch to the gut: Financial Guru Robert Dubois on life, love, and leaving the past behind. Simone's hand trembled as she clicked the link. The page loaded, revealing a series of perfectly lit, professionally shot photographs. There was Robert, looking tanned, vital, and at least 10 years younger than his actual age, laughing in a chic, minimalist apartment she had never seen before. And next to him, her hand placed possessively and intimately on his arm, was Chloe, looking radiant, adoring, and impossibly young. The article's caption identified her as his new partner and intellectual muse. Simone felt the blood drain from her face as she forced herself to read his words, each one a small, sharp betrayal. He spoke of their 40-year marriage as if it were a dusty old business that had finally been liquidated. He painted himself as a victim, a man who had felt stifled and intellectually lonely for years, a genius trapped in a world of quiet domesticity. And then came the quote that would be repeated in gossip columns for weeks. The quote that was so perfectly crafted, so deliberately cruel, it could only have been designed to publicly humiliate her and justify his betrayal in the court of public opinion. "Simone is a brilliant woman, of course," he said to the interviewer, his words a symphony of condescending, backhanded praise. "But her world is small, her passions, predictable. She finds her joy in the dusty archives of the past. I am a man who needs to constantly evolve, to be challenged by the future. I found that I was ready for a new chapter, a more vibrant one." He paused, for dramatic effect, she was sure. After a certain point, a long marriage can become a comfortable but ultimately boring historical text. I simply wanted to write a new book. Boring, predictable, a historical text. He had reduced their shared life, their intellectual partnership, her unwavering support, her profound and boundless love, to a series of dismissive, patronizing adjectives. He hadn't just left her. He had publicly rebranded her as a relic, a dusty museum piece he had to discard in order to evolve. It was a breathtakingly cruel act of public relations, a preemptive strike designed to win the sympathy of the world, leaving her to look like the bitter, sad, abandoned old wife who simply couldn't keep up. She sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the screen, at the picture of her husband and his young muse. The pain was a physical thing, a crushing pressure on her chest that made each breath a conscious, painful effort. The private heartbreak was a devastation, but the public humiliation, that was a declaration of war. He had not just closed the book on their marriage. He had tried to write her final chapter for her, casting her as the sad, forgotten character in the grand, exciting story of his new life. But Robert, in his all-consuming, blinding ego, had forgotten one crucial, fundamental thing about his wife. Simone Dubois was, above all else, a writer, an author, a historian. She was a master of narrative, and she would not let anyone, not even the man she had once loved more than life itself, write her ending for her. The story was not over, and she alone, would be the one to write the final, devastating, and irrefutable chapter. Most people, when faced with such a public and devastating betrayal, would crumble. They would retreat into a world of drawn curtains and tear-stained pillows. They would rage, they would mourn, they would break. But Simone Dubois was not most people. She was a historian. She understood that history is not just a collection of events. It is a narrative, a story told by the victors. Her husband had just fired the first shot in a war over that narrative, attempting to cast her as a tragic footnote in his own glorious tale. He had made a grave miscalculation. He had forgotten that she was the master storyteller. She did not cry. The tears had already been shed in private. She did not throw things. Such emotional displays were a luxury she could not afford. Instead, she sat at her large oak desk, the offending magazine article still glowing on her computer screen, and she began to think. She approached the situation as she would any complex historical problem, with cold, detached analysis. She identified the key players, assessed their weaknesses, and formulated a strategy. Her husband's greatest weakness had always been his vanity, his desperate need for public adoration, and his greatest love, besides himself, was his public image. That, she decided, would be the battlefield. She didn't have to wait long for an opportunity. In fact, it had been sitting in her email inbox for over a month, an invitation she had previously planned to decline. It was from the producer of Morning Focus with James Callahan, the nation's most watched morning news and talk show. It was a comfortable, mainstream program, known for its friendly interviews with authors, politicians, and celebrities. It was also, as Simone knew with a chilling certainty, Robert's favorite morning show. He watched it religiously every morning while he had his coffee, a ritual had maintained for over a decade. The producers wanted to interview her about her latest book, a dense but critically acclaimed work on the economic influence of Renaissance-era women. It was the kind of interview she usually found tedious, a 5-minute segment where she'd be expected to distill years of research into a few palatable sound bites for a mass audience. But now, the invitation felt like a gift from the heavens. It was a platform. It was a weapon. She picked up the phone and called her literary agent, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diana. "Diana," she said, her voice calm and clear. "That interview on Morning Focus. Is the offer still on the table?" Diana was surprised. "I thought you hated those shows, Simone. You said they were intellectually bankrupt." "My feelings have evolved," Simone replied, a hint of steel in her voice. "Please call them back. Tell them I would be delighted to appear. Tell them I'll be in New York next week and can come in on Tuesday." Diana, perceptive as always, could hear that something was different. "Simone, is everything all right?" "I saw the article about Robert." There was a pause. "Everything is about to be," Simone said, her voice so cold it could have formed icicles. "Just book the interview, Diana. And one more thing. Make sure you mention to the producers that I might be willing to, I briefly touch upon my personal life. Just a little. As a human interest angle. They'll like that." Diana, understanding immediately, just said, "Consider it done." The plan was in motion. Simone now had a stage, an audience of millions, and a secret that had been gathering dust for over 20 years. The week leading up to the interview was a masterclass in controlled preparation. She didn't rage. She researched. She went into her own personal archives, the boxes of old letters and financial statements she kept in her study. She was looking for one thing in particular, the file from 1998, the year of the Zurich miracle. She found it. The bank statements, the wire transfers, the tear-stained, guilt-ridden letters from the person Robert had betrayed to get his seed money. She made photocopies. She put them in a sealed envelope. The night before the interview, she did not toss and turn. She slept soundly. She was not a woman consumed by a quest for revenge. She was a historian about to correct the public record. She was an author about to write her final, irrefutable chapter. The next morning, she didn't choose a soft academic dress. She chose her armor, a stunning cobalt blue power suit that radiated confidence and authority. As she sat in the back of the car on the way to the television studio, she looked out at the city, her face a mask of serene, unshakable calm. The charade was set. The trap was laid. And the whole world was about to be invited to the execution. There is a profound and terrible stillness that settles over a soldier the night before a great battle. The rage has cooled, the fear has been reasoned with, and all that remains is a singular, crystalline focus on the task ahead. For Simone, the evening before her appearance on Morning Focus was exactly that. Her beautiful, book-lined home, once a sanctuary of shared love and intellectual partnership, was now her war room, and she was its sole, silent commander. She did not pace, she did not drink, she did not call friends for last-minute words of encouragement. Instead, she engaged in a quiet, meticulous ritual of preparation. She laid out the contents of the sealed manila envelope on her large dining room table, the same table where she had hosted countless dinner parties to boost her husband's career. The irony was not lost on her. The documents were ghosts from a past he thought was long buried. There was the bank statement from 1998, showing the large, unexplained wire transfer from an offshore account. There were the photocopies of the letters, desperate, pleading letters written in a frantic, spidery hand from the widow of Robert's deceased mentor and best friend, a man named Thomas. The letters spoke of a trust fund left for his children, a fund that had been mysteriously emptied. And finally, there was the tearful signed confession from the Swiss banker who had facilitated the illegal transfer, a man Simone had tracked down years later during one of her own research trips, a piece of insurance she had prayed she would never have to use. She looked at these artifacts of deceit not with anger, but with a historian's cold objectivity. Each document was a fact, a piece of irrefutable evidence. Together, they told a story. Not the myth of a lone genius and a mysterious benefactor that Robert had so carefully constructed, but a sordid, ugly little tale of theft, betrayal, and the exploitation of a grieving widow. This was the truth, and tomorrow she would be its vessel. She methodically arranged the key documents, placing small, unobtrusive sticky notes on the most damning passages. She was not planning to ambush the host. She was planning to guide him. She would lead him down a path of questions, and these documents would be the breadcrumbs. She rehearsed her lines, not like an actress, but like a lawyer preparing her closing argument. She practiced keeping her voice steady, calm, and factual. She knew her power would not come from shouting or crying, it would come from her unshakable academic credibility. Later that evening, she stood before her full-length mirror, not to admire her reflection, but to choose her armor. She dismissed the soft floral dresses of her past life. She bypassed the elegant but understated suits of her author persona. She needed something that communicated power, authority, and an absolute refusal to be seen as a victim. She chose a cobalt blue power suit with sharp, clean lines. The color was bold, unapologetic. It was the color of a deep, endless ocean, beautiful but formidable. She paired it with a simple strand of pearls, a symbol of a classic, timeless grace that could not be bought or faked. As she stood there, looking at the woman in the mirror, she saw a stranger and an old friend. The familiar lines of wisdom and age were there, but there was a new hardness in her eyes, a steel in her spine she had not felt in years. She was no longer just Simone Dubois, the celebrated author. She was no longer just Robert's wife. She was a woman who had been pushed too far, a woman who had rediscovered the formidable strength she had lent to her husband for far too long. He had forgotten who she was. Tonight, she was reminding herself. She did not toss and turn in her large, empty bed that night. She slept a deep, dreamless sleep. She was not a woman consumed by a quest for revenge. That was a word too small, too emotional for what she was about to do. This was not a crime of passion, it was a calculated historical correction. She was a historian about to set the public record straight. She was an author about to write her final, irrefutable chapter, and she was utterly, completely, and terrifyingly at peace. On the other side of the city, in a penthouse apartment that seemed to float above the clouds, a very different morning was unfolding. Robert Dubois was not preparing for battle. He was basking in the glow of a victory he believed was already won. For him, the war was over. He had shed his old life like a snake sheds its skin, and he was now sleek, new, and untouchable. Or so he thought. He stood in front of a massive flat-screen television, the volume turned up high. The Morning Focus theme music filled the room. He was wearing a ridiculously expensive silk robe, a cup of exotic, single-origin coffee in his hand. His recently dyed hair was perfectly coiffed. He looked less like a historian and more like a parody of a wealthy, aging celebrity. Chloe, his young muse, was draped over a white leather sofa, scrolling idly through her phone. "Are you really going to watch this whole thing?" she asked, her voice bored. "It's just your ex-wife talking about some dusty old book." Robert chuckled, a sound full of condescending amusement. "Of course I am, my dear," he said, not taking his eyes off the screen. "It's a matter of professional curiosity. I need to see if she can still string a coherent sentence together without me there to edit her. Besides," he added, a cruel smirk playing on his lips, "it's always entertaining to watch a relic be put on display." His arrogance was a palpable thing, an atmospheric pressure in the room. In his mind, he had already won the narrative. The magazine article had been a masterstroke. He was the dynamic, evolving genius. She was the stagnant, boring past. Her appearance on this show, in his view, could only serve to reinforce that narrative. He imagined her looking frail, sad, perhaps a little lost without him. The world would see her, and they would feel pity. Then they would see him, with his beautiful young partner and his vibrant new life, and they would understand. They would approve. The host, James Callahan, introduced her. "Please welcome the brilliant author and historian, Simone Dubois." Robert leaned closer to the screen, a critical, judgmental look on his face. When Simone appeared, looking not frail or sad, but radiant and powerful in her cobalt blue suit, his smirk faltered for just a moment. He grunted, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Antoine must have gotten to her. He was so vain, he couldn't imagine her looking so confident without the intervention of his own stylist. He couldn't comprehend that her strength came from within. Chloe looked up from her phone. "Wow, that's a bold color," she said, her tone dripping with cattiness. "She's certainly trying hard." "Let her," Robert said, his confidence returning. "A new coat of paint doesn't change what's underneath the hood. She's still the same predictable, tedious woman she's always been." They watched the first part of the interview with a detached, mocking air. When Simone spoke intelligently about her book, Robert would offer condescending commentary. "Ah yes, the Medici banking theory. I gave her that idea over dinner back in '08, head lie," puffing out his chest. When the host praised her prose, Chloe would yawn dramatically. They were not listening to her words. They were waiting for a crack in her facade, a moment of weakness they could pounce on and laugh about later. They were completely, blissfully, and fatally unaware that they were not the audience watching a performance. They were the subjects of a meticulous, public dissection, and the surgeon was just now beginning to make her first incision. The host, James, began to wrap up. "Simone, before we let you go," Robert smiled. This was it. The part where she would be asked about him, and she would likely offer some sad, diplomatic, "we wish each other the best" platitude. He was ready to laugh. But then Simone leaned forward. She looked directly into the camera, directly at him. Her smile was no longer the polite, academic smile of an author. It was something else. Something sharp, knowing, and dangerous. And she began to speak. "I'm sure Robert is watching right now from his new apartment." Robert froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Chloe put down her phone. The air in the penthouse suddenly became very still. They leaned in, their mockery replaced by a sudden intense focus. They had no idea what was coming. They were like two characters in a Greek tragedy, standing on the stage, watching a messenger approach, completely oblivious to the devastating news he was about to deliver, news that would bring their entire world crashing down around them. Live television is a tightly controlled dance, a high-wire act performed without a net. Every second is scripted, every smile is rehearsed, every commercial break is timed to the millisecond. The entire enterprise is designed to create an illusion of spontaneous, comfortable conversation. But Simone Dubois, in that moment, took a pair of shears to that high wire. She threw out the script, dismissed the choreographer, and became the master of her own chaotic, beautiful, and terrifying masterpiece. The host, James Callahan, a man paid millions for his ability to control a conversation, could only watch, a stunned passenger on a ride he could no longer steer. In the glass-walled control room, producers were likely screaming into their headsets, fingers hovering over the cut-to-commercial button, but on the screen, there was only Simone, in complete and total, terrifying command. She held that direct, unblinking gaze with the camera's red light, forging a silent, intimate connection with the millions watching at home. But her true audience was one man, sitting in his sterile penthouse, a man whose world was balanced on a precipice he didn't even know existed. My ex-husband, I should say. She corrected herself with a small, sharp smile that didn't touch her eyes. The correction itself was a small, public stab, a reminder of his recent betrayal. He recently granted an interview to a rather glossy magazine. In it, he posited a theory that our 40-year marriage ended because I had become, in his own carefully chosen words, predictable and boring. It's a simple, effective narrative, isn't it? The brilliant, dynamic man, ever evolving, leaving his quiet, uninteresting academic wife behind. It's a story as old as time. She paused, a master of timing, letting the weight of that public insult settle over the national audience. She allowed them to feel the sting of it on her behalf. "So, I thought today," she continued, her voice as smooth and polished as the marble floor in Robert's new lobby, in the spirit of keeping things interesting, "I would do something a little unpredictable." James, the host, finally rebooted. His professional training kicked in, and he tried to wrestle back control, to steer the ship back to the safe, pre-approved waters of book promotion. Simone. A fascinating perspective, he said, his voice a little strained, his famous smile looking pasted on. But let's talk about your new book, The Women of Florence. It's a remarkable piece of scholarship. But Simone was no longer his guest. She was the host now. She ignored him as if he were a piece of furniture, her focus still entirely on the camera, on Robert. "Robert, darling," she said, the term of endearment now dripping with a delicious, poisonous irony that was surely chilling him to the bone. "I'm so glad you're watching. I know how much you love this show. I want to talk about your origin story. You know, the one you tell so well at all your expensive dinner parties. The myth of Robert Dubois." In the penthouse, the color was draining from Robert's face. The coffee cup in his hand trembled slightly. Chloe had put down her phone, her bored expression replaced by a knot of confusion and unease. This was not the sad, defeated performance they had expected. This was something else entirely. Simone continued, her pacing perfect, her tone light and conversational, as if she were sharing a charming anecdote with a dear friend. "You always talk about your big break, don't you? That pivotal moment. The research trip to Zurich in 1998. The trip that led to your breakout bestseller. The one that made you a household name, the Zurich collapse. You tell the story so beautifully. The story of the mysterious, anonymous Swiss benefactor, a wealthy philanthropist who, out of the blue, saw your genius and decided to fund your research when no one else would. It's a wonderful story. A story of a lone genius, battling against the establishment, finally recognized and rewarded. It's truly inspiring." She leaned forward slightly in her chair, her body language shifting from relaxed to predatory. Her smile faded completely, replaced by an expression of intense, piercing sincerity that was far more terrifying. "And this morning, I want to honor that story. By telling the truth." Across the nation, millions of people leaned closer to their television screens. The producers in the control room stopped shouting and just stared at their monitors, paralyzed. James Callahan was utterly frozen, a deer in the headlights of an oncoming train. This was no longer an interview. It was a public reckoning, broadcast live in high definition. "There was no mysterious benefactor, James," Simone said, finally turning to the host, a small act of professional courtesy, though her words were for the world. "There was no anonymous grant from a Swiss Arts and Humanities Foundation. That was a story, a fiction, a very convenient, very well-crafted lie he has been telling for over 20 years. She paused again, the silence stretching for a full 3 seconds, an eternity in live television. She let the bomb drop softly, without any dramatic flourish, which only made its impact more devastating. "The seed money for my husband's career-making trip," she said, her voice clear and unwavering as a church bell on a cold morning. "The money that funded his research, his travel, his entire future, came from the recently widowed wife of his own mentor and best friend, a brilliant but unassuming professor named Thomas Blackwood, who had just passed away from a long and terrible battle with cancer." She let that information land. She let the audience connect the dots. The mentor, the best friend, the widow. "Thomas had left behind a trust fund," she continued, her voice methodical, like a historian presenting her findings. "A modest one, intended solely for the college education of his 2 young, fatherless children. Robert, as his most trusted friend, was named the executor of that trust. He was entrusted with protecting that money, with safeguarding the future of the children of his dead best friend." She looked back at the camera, her eyes now burning with a cold, righteous fire. "And in the summer of 1998, she declared, her voice precise and deadly, that entire trust fund, every last penny, was illegally and secretly wired from a small community bank in Ohio to a private, numbered account in Zurich. The account belonged to my husband. The bomb had not just been dropped, it had detonated. The silence in the television studio was no longer one of rapt attention. It was the deafening, ringing silence that follows a massive explosion. James Callahan, the host, sat paralyzed, his mouth slightly agape, his cue cards forgotten in his lap. His face, usually a mask of effortless charm, was now a canvas of pure, unadulterated shock. For the first time in his 20-year career, he had absolutely no idea what to say. In the control room, the initial paralysis broke, and a panicked cacophony erupted. "Cut to commercial! Cut to commercial now!" The executive producer was likely screaming into his headset. But the director, mesmerized by the raw, historic television unfolding before him, let the cameras roll for a few seconds longer. In his penthouse, Robert Dubois let out a guttural, animalistic sound, a noise that was half choke, half scream. The expensive coffee cup slipped from his trembling hand and shattered on the polished marble floor, the dark liquid splashing across the white leather sofa like a spray of blood. "She's lying," he gasped, stumbling backward, his face ashen. "The woman is insane! She's making it all up!" Chloe stared at him, her beautiful face a mixture of confusion and a dawning, horrified suspicion. "Robert? What is she talking about? Robert?" But Simone was not finished. She knew that a shocking accusation, without proof, was merely slander. She had come prepared to deliver the evidence. She reached down beside her chair and lifted a sleek, leather-bound portfolio onto her lap. She looked at the stunned host, her expression now softening into one of almost pitying composure, as if she were a teacher guiding a slow student through a difficult lesson. "James," she said, her voice calm and steady amidst the chaos she had unleashed, "I would never make such a serious claim without evidence. I am a historian, after all. We deal in primary sources." She opened the portfolio. "This," she said, holding up a clear, plastic-sleeved document for the camera to see, "is a copy of the original wire transfer request from the Ohio Bank dated the 14th of August, 1998. You'll note the signature at the bottom is my husband's, as executor of the Blackwood Children's Trust, and you'll note the destination account number, in Zurich." She slid the document across the table to the paralyzed host. She then held up another, and this is a letter. A letter from Catherine Blackwood, Thomas' widow, sent to me a few months after the transfer. In it, she is weeping on the page, asking if I knew why the trust had been emptied, why Robert was no longer returning her calls. She was afraid her children would not be able to go to college. A fear, I might add, that I secretly rectified years later with my own money. This new detail, this secret act of penance and kindness, added another layer of quiet heroism to her, and another layer of monstrousness to Robert. The control room finally regained control. The screen abruptly cut to a jarringly cheerful commercial for a breakfast cereal. But the damage was done, the story was out, and the fallout was just beginning. In his apartment, Robert was hyperventilating, clutching his chest, his face slick with sweat. "She's a liar, a bitter, vengeful liar." He wheezed at Chloe, but the conviction in his voice was gone, replaced by pure, raw panic. Chloe was backing away from him slowly, her phone in her hand, her expression one of dawning disgust and calculation. The intellectual muse was realizing that her brilliant mentor was, in fact, a common thief, and his carefully constructed brand was now radioactive. Back in the studio, during the commercial break, the scene was one of controlled chaos. The executive producer was on the stage, his face purple, whispering furiously to James. Simone simply sat in her chair, calmly taking a sip of water. She had done what she came to do. When the producer turned to her, his eyes blazing, she simply looked at him and said, "You wanted a human interest angle. I gave you one." The show did not return to the interview. When they came back from the commercial, James, looking pale and shaken, offered a rushed apology for technical difficulties and quickly moved on to the weather report. But across the country, the internet was exploding. The clip of Simone's revelation was already going viral. Zurich collapse was the #1 trending topic on Twitter. The story was no longer Simone's. It belonged to the world now. The final, devastating blow was yet to come. As the story spread like wildfire, a journalist from a major newspaper did some quick digging. They called the Ohio Bank. They found Catherine Blackwood, now an old woman living a quiet life. She confirmed the entire story. But then they found something else. They discovered that the Swiss banker who had facilitated the transfer had been arrested years later for a separate case of financial fraud, and, in his plea bargain, had given a full confession about all his past activities, including the illegal transfer for a desperate American professor back in 1998. The confession had been sealed, but now, with this new public interest, it was about to be unsealed. Back in the penthouse, Robert's phone began to ring. It was his publisher, then his agent, then a lawyer. Chloe was already packing a bag. He collapsed onto the sofa, the shattered coffee cup still at his feet, and just stared blankly at the television, where a weatherman was cheerfully pointing at a map. His empire, his reputation, his carefully crafted myth, it had all been dismantled in the space of 3 minutes, live on national television, by the boring, predictable woman he had so foolishly underestimated. And the paramedics? Oh yes. As the first news vans began to pull up outside his luxury apartment building, the stress, the public humiliation, and the terror of impending legal doom became too much for his aging heart to bear. The call to 911 was made not by him, but by Chloe, a final, parting act of detached obligation before she walked out of his life forever. The story had ended exactly as the thumbnail had promised. A story doesn't truly end when the villain is defeated. It ends when the hero finds their peace. The fallout from what the media quickly dubbed the morning show massacre was swift, brutal, and absolute. Robert Dubois did not go to prison. The statute of limitations on his financial crimes had passed years ago. But he faced a punishment far worse for a man of his colossal ego. He was sentenced to a life of utter irrelevance. His publisher dropped him, citing a morals clause in his contract. The university where he had been a celebrated professor suspended him, and he quietly retired a few months later to avoid the humiliation of being fired. His new book was cancelled. His old ones were pulled from the front tables of bookstores. He was disinvited from conferences, his name becoming a cautionary tale whispered in academic hallways. The young and vibrant Chloe, of course, had vanished, leaving him to face the ruins of his life alone in a minimalist apartment that now felt like a prison. He had built his entire identity on a foundation of public respect and intellectual authority, and in 3 devastating minutes, Simone had taken a sledgehammer to it all. He was forced to live out his days as the man he had always feared becoming, a footnote in someone else's much more interesting story. And Simone? Simone did not revel in his destruction. She did not watch the news reports or read the salacious articles. She had not acted out of a desire to see him suffer. She had acted out of a need to reclaim her own truth. And with that truth finally spoken, a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying for 20 years simply lifted from her shoulders. It was a profound, soul-deep exhalation. She was, for the first time in a very long time, free. The world, it turned out, was not interested in her as Robert's victim. They were fascinated by her as a hero. Her publisher, initially terrified of the scandal, was now ecstatic. The demand for her work skyrocketed. Morning Focus begged her to come back for a full, hour-long exclusive interview. She politely declined. She had said everything she needed to say. She had no interest in becoming a professional ex-wife. She was, and always had been, a historian and a writer. But she did do one thing. She announced she was writing a new book, not a historical text about the Renaissance, but a memoir. It was to be called The Zurich Secret. The book deal she signed was the largest of her career, but the book was not an act of revenge. It was an act of reclamation. It was her story to tell, in her words, on her terms. It was the story of a partnership, of a betrayal, and ultimately, of a woman finding the strength to correct the historical record of her own life. She used the massive advance from the book to do 2 things. First, she fully and formally endowed a permanent scholarship at the university in the name of Thomas Blackwood's children, ensuring his memory would be honored in perpetuity. It was a debt she felt she had to repay on a cosmic level. Second, she started a small foundation, the Simone Dubois Foundation for Women's Voices, dedicated to funding and supporting female historians and nonfiction writers who were struggling to get their first works published. She became the benefactor she had once been forced to be in secret, but now she did it openly, joyfully, and for strangers. Her life became quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was not the silence of loneliness, but the tranquility of purpose. She found joy not in public acclaim, but in the letters she received from young writers her foundation had helped. She found peace in her garden, in the company of old friends, and in the profound, beautiful solitude of her work. She had not just survived, she had thrived. She had taken the ugliest chapter of her life and used it to write her most beautiful ending. It's a powerful thing, a narrative, the story people tell about you. For years, Simone allowed her husband to be the author of her story. He defined her, and then he tried to discard her. Her final, brilliant act was not one of revenge, but of authorship. She took back the pen. She reminded the world, and more importantly, herself, that she was the one who decided how her story would be told. So I ask you, as I always do, think about the stories of your own life. Are you the author, or have you let someone else hold the pen for too long? It's never too late to write a new chapter. It's never too late to tell your own truth, in your own voice. Share your wisdom with all of us in the comments below. What does it mean to you to be the author of your own life? Every story shared here is a testament to that strength. Thank you for listening.